Welcome, fellow detectives. My name is Kent Jaffa. This presentation is part one of a two-part series on being a family history detective. Yes, you really are a detective when doing family history. It requires your best detective skills, so we will be reviewing these skills. Our investigation today is an important one. Is your great uncle really your great aunt? So grab your spyglass, binoculars, and notepad, and let's begin. We have all watched television shows or movies about detectives, so we have some idea about what a good detective is. As you research your family, you need to know these skills in order to put together a good, solid case. What would a good detective do? Would a good detective base his entire case on one piece of evidence, or would he find multiple pieces of evidence? Are some types of evidence more reliable than other types? This is the topic that we will be discussing during this presentation. Think about it. What would happen if you went to trial with only one piece of evidence? You would have a hard time convincing the jury. One piece of evidence can be viewed from several different perspectives. Obviously, the more evidence you have, the stronger your case will be. In medicine, the news is always full of stories, one showing this is harmful and another showing the same thing is healthy. For instance, I once saw a study that showed there was an association between getting cancer and owning a pet parrot. Luckily, this was just one study, and the parrot did not need to go. In science, one study only generates an hypothesis. One study does not prove anything. A number of years ago, I found out I had lymphoma. A friend of mine was convinced I did not need chemotherapy. All I needed to do was to take my clothes off and sit under a certain color light each day. My friend was convinced when you took a pill, it wasn't the chemicals in the pill that mattered. It was the color the pill turned to in your stomach. Thus, chemotherapy could be replaced by sitting under the right colored light. If you were in my shoes, would you be convinced that this was the right thing to do? To follow this well-meaning advice? Besides how much evidence you have, the quality of the evidence does matter. These same principles apply to genealogy. If you do not do good detective work, the next piece of evidence could sever a big branch of your family tree. You could lose 100 ancestors when the next piece of evidence comes along. It is just good common sense for a detective to make a reasonably exhaustive search to find as much evidence as possible, so he is comfortable that his conclusions are correct, and the next piece of evidence will only make his conclusions stronger, rather than blow them away. In family history work, this does not mean every rock must be turned over, or you will never make a conclusion. It does, however, mean that you need to find enough evidence so you are comfortable with your conclusions, that they are reasonably solid. Of course, you can never be 100% sure, but you can be reasonably sure. This means you need to have at least two independent sources of evidence that agree with each other. By independent, the evidence should not be based on the same source or come from the same source. For example, the birth date on a death certificate and a grave headstone probably came from the same informant. You also need to make sure that some of your evidence comes from primary sources or from informants who were eyewitnesses of an event. Evidence that is solely based on hearsay or secondary evidence is not reliable enough to count on. Thus, a birth date on a birth certificate is primary evidence if the informant was present at the birth. 90 years later, when you die, your birth date on your death certificate is most likely a secondary source or hearsay, since the informant was not present at your birth. Primary information is more reliable than hearsay. As a good detective, you also want to have some evidence from original sources, and in genealogy, this means you should not rely solely on the transcript of a record when you have the opportunity to look at the original record. Another important finding is timing. When did the informant witness or record the event in relationship to when the event occurred? Which is better, interviewing a witness as soon as possible or interviewing a witness years later? It is just good old gumshoe common sense. What should you do if you find some conflicting evidence? Should you just ignore it? Of course, you shouldn't ignore it if you want to have a reasonably solid case. In family history, it is important to reconcile or resolve conflicting evidence. We will look at some of this during our investigation. In days gone by, Family Search sponsored the Ancestral File, followed by Pedigree Resource File, where people could put their family trees for others to see and collaborate. Today, there are several online trees. Time doesn't allow mentioning each of these, but a few examples include Family Search's Family Tree, Ancestry.com Member Trees, and MyHeritage.com Trees. Just how reliable are these trees that are posted on the internet? Well, put on your detective hat and ask a few questions. Is there enough information to tell whether an online tree is based on secondary or hearsay evidence, or is it based on solid evidence? You can tell by looking at the evidence contained in the sources that are used to document each person's vital information. You could also verify several persons' information to get a feel for how reliable the tree is. Many, however, only consider online trees to be just guides for further research. They are only hearsay until information can be verified, unless you find a tree that has been based on sources and has reasonably solid evidence to support its findings. You can find examples today of well-sourced online trees, but the larger majority are not well-sourced, and there is no way to tell without you verifying it or interviewing the owner. I think it is safe to say that most online trees, no matter what website they are on, should cautiously be considered and used only as a guide for further research, rather than assuming they are correct and based on solid evidence, because you just cannot tell how accurate they are unless they are well sourced. So let's start our first investigation. Let's investigate this online tree information that used to be found on Family Tree for Philander M. Sawyer. This example was given to me by Catherine Grant. First, we noticed that Philander was a male who was born about 1839 and lived in Starksboro, Addison County, Vermont. If we look at Philander's family, we also notice that his parents are Warren Sawyer and Maria Houston. Knowing this information about Philander's family will help us know if we are looking at the correct Philander when we come across other records. Also, notice who his siblings were. So let's take a look at the 1850 U.S. Census and do a quick online search and see if we can find Philander. Ta-da! We find Philander, and he is living in the household of Warner Sawyer. Warner. I thought his father's name was Warren. We'll have to look at this a little closer. However, the record also shows Philander was a male and was born in about 1839 in Starksboro, Addison County, Vermont. That matches our information. Others in the household include other family members we saw on the online tree, including his mother, who is using her married name as Maria Sawyer. Thus, it sounds like we have the right Philander, but don't forget, we need to look at the original record. We now take a look at the original image of the 1850 U.S. Census. We see they are living in Starksboro, as expected. It is hard to see, but if you look at Philander's father's name, the handwriting is fairly poor, and you see that it could have been interpreted as Warner or Warren. It must have been Warren. And yes, Philander is an 11-year-old male. It looks like we found our Philander, and this is consistent with what we saw in the online tree. So, fellow detectives, do we have enough information to solve our case? We looked at the 1850 U.S. Census, and everything is consistent with the online tree. Is our great-uncle Philander our uncle? Well, think about it for a minute. Does one piece of evidence build a reasonably solid conclusion? In the old days, say 10 to 20 years ago, access to records was much more difficult and expensive. At that time, some relative must have been researching this family and decided one source of evidence was sufficient. Lucky for us, it is much more easier, way more easier, to find sources today, and any respectable detective would look for more evidence. It only takes another minute or so to find Philander in the 1860 U.S. Census. His name is given, however, as Philinda Sawyer, but he is living with his father, Warren, and his mother, Maria. This has to be the right family. However, yikes! We find that Philinda is a female, not a male. Is it a male or a female? I did look at the original census record, and it agrees with this transcription. It has to be the right family. What should we do now? Quit and cut our losses? Flip a coin? Is he male or female? No. A good detective wants to solve the mystery. There are more records to investigate. Another couple of minutes tick by, and we find a marriage record for our Philinda. You notice she's a bride. This has got to be the right Philinda. Her parents are Warren and Maria Sawyer, and they're living in Starksboro. And her new husband is Lionel Hill. They were married in 1861. Oh! Great Uncle Philinda starting to look like our aunt. They were married in 1861. I wonder if Lionel enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War. A great pay-per-view site on Civil War records is threefold. That can be viewed at Family History Centers for free, or you can view it at home as a pay-per-view site. A quick check on this site shows further evidence that Lionel T. Hill was her husband. He enlisted in the Union Army about 1.5 years after their marriage. Unfortunately, Lionel dies a few months later, leaving Philinda a young widow. Later, in 1863, Philinda applies for a widow's pension. Our investigation takes us back to Ancestry.com, where we find the birth of a Sarah Maria Hill. Look who the mother is. It's Philinda Hill, and it says she was a widow. And she is living in Starksboro. This has got to be our Philinda. Finally, we find Philinda died in 1893 at age 33. Her death record also indicates she was a female. Thus, by spending another 1 to 2 hours using online records, your investigation has provided reasonably solid evidence. Yes, your great-uncle really was your great-aunt. That could really break down a brick wall. It certainly would change your family tree. She had 2 husbands, and other records show she was a mother. Obviously, the 1850 census enumerator must have made an error when he recorded the information. Congratulations, you have solved the case. Here is a second example of an online tree with a problem. It was pointed out to me by Heather McPhee. The parents of this family are William Stephen Mueller and Lucille Jane Stamps. However, as a detective, you notice something suspicious. You would normally not expect the parents to have 3 daughters, all with the same first given name and middle initial. Perhaps the first Sarah died, and they named another child Sarah. Then the second Sarah dies, and they named the third daughter Sarah. This, however, looks suspicious, especially since at least 2 of these daughters died as adults in the same year. A good detective would verify this information before accepting it as valid. In a few hours, using online records, Heather discovered that 2 of these Sarahs shared the same middle name, Adeline, and 2 of them, for sure, were the same Sarah. However, the third one had a different husband, but is possibly the same Sarah. The take-home message is online trees need to be verified. If the vital information is well sourced, then it is more likely to be correct, especially if there are multiple sources of evidence for each fact. In bygone days, verification would be time-consuming. It is understandable why someone may not have done a complete investigation. However, now is a different time. There are many online sources, and verification is easy and relatively quick. In summary, good old common sense rules for a good detective dictate that we should make a reasonably exhaustive search for evidence. This search should include at least 2 independent sources or informants that agree with each other. We should base our conclusions on enough evidence that we are reasonably confident that our conclusions will not be overturned by further research. Our evidence should also include primary information and not be based solely on secondary or hearsay information. We should always look at the original images rather than relying solely on the transcripts, especially if the original images are reasonably available. We need to remember evidence that is given near the time of an event is generally more reliable than if it is given years later. If we find conflicting evidence, we should not ignore it. It may provide important clues. If not, then we need to understand why there is a conflict. Remember, online trees need to be verified if they are not well sourced. Otherwise, we have no way of knowing how solid the information is. You can learn more about this very interesting subject by referring to the book by Tom Jones, Mastering Genealogical Proof, which is published by the National Genealogical Society. You can also find videos on this subject on Ancestry.com's YouTube channel and at FamilySearch.org's Learning Center by searching on the word evidence. Also, don't forget to look at Part 2, Advanced Detective Studies. In Part 2 of this series, we will investigate differences between record transcriptions and actual images of the source, and show how these errors can have a large impact on your investigation. We will then apply all of the techniques we have learned in Parts 1 and Part 2 to a more complex problem. Congratulations, fellow detectives. We've covered a lot of information today. I may have gone too fast in certain sections for you to see exactly what I mean. Don't worry. You can always go back and look at this video again and pause it at the sections you'd like to look at in more detail. You can find the video at fsfamilytreeusergroup.com. Finally, good luck, fellow detectives. Good luck with your further research. And I hope to see you in Part 2, Advanced Detective Studies.